Good afternoon, this is Sean Golding with Golding & Golding, here to discuss the basics of exit tax planning. Just an introduction, exit tax planning is very comprehensive. Essentially what it is if you're a U.S. person, either a long-term resident or a U.S. citizen by birth or naturalization, turns out that you're a covered expatriate, which we'll go through in a minute, then you may become subject to exit tax. Exit tax planning is something that you would do beforehand, and it's crucial because you can't really do anything about it after. The set day is the value the day before you expatriate. Okay, so there's two categories, right? You've got long-term residents who are defined as legal permanent residents who have been legal permanent residents, so we may just refer to it as LPR, for 8 of the last 15 years, or a U.S. citizen by birth or naturalization. That's step one. You're in one of these two categories, assuming that there's no exceptions, exclusions, limitations, things of that nature. Then you have to move on to the 3 tests to see if you're a covered expatriate. Your goal is to avoid any of these tests. You don't have to meet all 3, just one. The net worth test says that the individual has a net worth of $2 million, noting that net worth is not the same as gross value. If you happen to have a home that's worth $2.4 million, but you have a mortgage worth $1 million, you wouldn't be a covered expatriate. Net income tax liability test. You have to do the net income tax liability for the previous 5 years. That amount can vary. It's generally around $160,000 to $165,000. Again, that's net income tax liability, not gross tax liability. If you had foreign tax credits or whatnot to bring the net income tax liability down, that can help. And then there's the 5-year certification. This is sort of the tricky one because even if you're safely below the net worth test and the net income tax liability test, well, if you're below if you can't certify that for the last 5 years, you've been tax compliant in the U.S., well, guess what? You're considered a covered expatriate as well. So if you think you may be dancing around these issues, you think you may possibly be a covered expatriate, maybe not. If you're a covered expatriate, you think you may be subject to exit tax. Let's go through. So when you're a covered expatriate, then you can be considered, you have to do a mark-to-mark analysis. I have separate presentations to help you with some of these topics, but you do a mark-to-mark analysis on a bunch of the assets, then you have deemed distribution for other assets, such as ineligible for in retirement, yada yada, you mix it in a pot. And then if you're above the exclusion amount, which is around $722,000, I believe, then you have to pay an exit tax at whatever the progressive rate is for that tax when you exit. So the first thing, of course, is to avoid being a legal permanent resident. I mean, I've spoken to lots of people over my career where they didn't have any need to be a legal permanent resident. I mean, they don't spend that much time in the U.S. They probably could have easily just gotten a travel visa or visa waiver, depending on the country, or possibly a work visa. But they receive legal permanent residence because maybe their employer sponsored them. So that's something to consider beforehand, because if you don't need the LPR status, then there's not going to be much benefit other than you're going to be taxed as a U.S. person, and then you may be subject to exit tax. If you are a legal permanent resident, then the next thing, of course, is try to avoid long-term residence. Okay, the way you do that is make sure that you're not a legal permanent resident for at least 8 of the last 15 years. Now, it doesn't mean full years, so that's something to consider. The easiest way to think about it is just 8 years, 8 different years, right? Not 8 full 365 or 366 day years. The other thing would be to voluntarily abandon your LPR status. So this is where a lot of people get into trouble unnecessarily. Just letting the green card expire doesn't mean you gave up your legal permanent residence. Why? Because the green card is just representation of legal permanent residence. Just letting it expire doesn't mean you're no longer a legal permanent resident. It may mean that you've got some issues in terms of being in the U.S., but it doesn't give up your tax status. So one of the easiest things to do is just to file an I-407 and voluntarily abandon your legal permanent residence. Do it before the 8 years, and then it won't be an issue. If that's not viable for citizens, it's not, of course, and it just for one reason or another, you've already passed it, or those strategies have since passed. Some tips for planning would be try to reduce your net worth. There's no look back period per se, so if you're able to gift the money to a spouse, to a family member, that could help. One thing to keep in mind is if you gift it to a U.S. citizen spouse or a legal permanent resident, long-term resident, and then they're going to have to expatriate, well, you're just kind of kicking the can down the road. It may not accomplish the final goal. One other very important planning situation we deal with a lot is when clients have foreign retirement plans. Those plans are designed to grow tax-free in the foreign country, but those are generally not going to have a U.S. administrator, right? So it's going to be an ineligible deferred compensation plan, which then turns into a deemed distribution on the day before you expatriate. It kind of makes the whole thing go away, right? All the benefit is now gone, especially if you get some preferred tax rates overseas. So something to consider is how to somehow transmute the plan, transfer the plan, maybe move it into a savings account without receiving a deemed distribution in the foreign country. Something you can do from a planning technique in order to avoid the tax, in order to avoid it being a deemed distribution in the U.S. and basically negating all your hard work. My name is Sean Golding. That's an introduction to exit tax planning. We have lots of free resources on our main site, goldinglawyers.com. We also have a sister website, expatriationattorneys.com, to help guide you through some of these issues. Thank you for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day.